What is going on, Hot Take Nation? It is DRW here, and we have another of our fun Wednesday episodes. And today, Jeremy Ryan Slate joins us. Jeremy, first, how are you doing?
Hey, brother, I'm doing awesome. I'm just stoked to, kind of start my week with you today, man.
So we started just before we got on camera. We were talking a little bit of professional sports. And so did you happen to see the Chiefs Broncos game yesterday evening?
I did, and the thing that was surprising to me is like Mahomes does what Mahomes always does, which is throwing for a lot of yards. But the thing that's really surprising, because it's not typically an Andy Reid thing, but the Chiefs suck in the red zone, man. They have 4 field goals on 4 red zone trips. So that's something they really got to worry about. Or 11-1 isn't going to last very long.
But it is truly amazing. Like Mahomes thinking about, like, one of the themes I've been on lately is meritocracy. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in terms of like how one builds a brand and builds a life. And I had done a post on Twitter that went crazy viral. It was sort of a throwaway comment about if you didn't get a 3.6 GPA in college or high school, and you don't like your life today, check your GPA. Right? Because like when you commit to do something right and merit takes control, you end up with a Patrick Mahomes who signs a $500 million contract. Mm-hmm. And watching him play is something truly special. I mean, it's crazy, right?
It is too. And the thing that's interesting about him, because like if you watch him, like he's a guy that they were talking about, like, the announcers were saying, they always ask him like, Patrick, what are you working on right now? And he'll be like, oh, my footwork. I'm really working on my footwork right now. It's not like I want it to be. He like works on like mechanics and like the fundamentals so often. That's why he's really good, right? Like you look at like anything in business or in life or whatever, people try to get a little too crazy. That's when it doesn't go well. It's the people that do the fundamentals really, really well. You can do a lot with them and, do it kind of effortlessly. That's where the big time comes in.
Yeah, and I mean, and just to watch like his scrambling ability and his knowledge, and it ties really well to the theme of today's show, which is a bit around meritocracy. It's a bit around taking control of your life. It's a bit around facing death. It's a bit around finding what you're good at. And so why don't you tell the listeners who won't be familiar with you about Command Your Brand, but also just about Jeremy the man before we get into some of these questions.
So at Command Your Brand, we are a PR firm that specializes on booking podcasts. We really try to make a great connection between awesome hosts and our awesome clients. In terms of like what I do with my life, it's funny you mentioned the GPA thing. Like I'm one of those like highly educated people that doesn't use my degree. So I have an undergrad degree in Catholic theology and Old Testament. And I've studied literature at New College, Oxford, got my master's in early Roman Empire propaganda. Not a very applicable skill in like the world of getting a job. They're not. Really,
it kind of sounds applicable to the U.S. Culture right now.
I would say that absolutely.
Right, okay, we'll talk about that. But so you had a degree. You had a degree that clearly wasn't cheap either, right? I would imagine.
No, it was very expensive.
Very expensive, but not great for job prospects.
Correct. Yeah, so I went through, kind of a bunch of different things until I ended up in podcasting, which is like, I arrived here just because I was a fan. Like I've loved podcasts since like 05, 06 when, they were really hard to find. I've listened to the same one for 14 years now. I think they're going on episodes of the show called the No Agenda Show. So for me, I was somebody that loved this space, didn't really kind of know where my life and my career was going. And that's kind of how I ended up here.
So podcasting is an interesting one, and I want to talk about that. But we're going to park that subject for the time being, and let's talk about your reflection as an older person who came out of high school and decided that Catholic theology and Roman propaganda as like an undergrad and a master's. And again, I mean, we're probably talking 2000, so Price University might have been 30 to 35,000 US a year, kind of.
That's about right.
So,
yeah, that's about right.
So you invested $180,000 roughly, not inflation adjusted. Talk about the pros and the cons of that approach in the context of students thinking about going to university today against a backdrop of $70,000 a year tuition, against a backdrop of a different job market that post-COVID is fluid. Jobs that used to exist won't exist, and jobs that didn't exist will exist. How do you reconcile all that, and what advice do you give to young people on that subject?
Well, I'll tell you what, man, like there's a really big disconnect between the two, right? Like, how many kids at 17, 18, 19 years old knew what they want to do the rest of their life, or even if their career they want is going to exist, right? Like there's so many things people are going to school for that aren't going to exist for 5 years from now, 10 years from now, or the career they may have isn't even real yet. So I think like the biggest thing missing is this idea of apprenticeships. And that's where you would work under somebody for a period of time, learn about the career, learn all the different things you need to know about it. So I think in a certain way, like the education system needs to kind of redesign, right? Because maybe when you go from high school to college, there should be something in between there where you have an apprenticeship for a period of time. You work a little bit, you figure it out because you learn a lot about life and about the world. And at the same time, it's weird to me, right, that you can't get a loan to start a business, but they'll give you $150,000 to get a college education, not saying that you can produce anything when you're out. So I think like the inflation of college is driven by the availability of money, which is a little bit ridiculous because most of those people aren't going to pay it back. I think what we need to do is take a look at that system as well, and maybe reduce the cost by about 90%, and then what you would do is you'd say, well, for the first 5 years of employment, we're going to get 5% or 15% of whatever you make. Well, they'll turn out some good students then, man, because they have to, or they're not going to make any money.
Well, I also think that it's interesting that all these topics, like COVID, has brought so much to the forefront. My son is 15,
Yeah.
and I have been actively campaigning for him to take a gap year. Now, if you pulled me aside 2 years ago and said, "What do you think about your kids taking a gap year?" Much less between like university and grade 12, but in between grade 10 and 11, I would have said I was crazy. But as I look at maturity and it was sort of what the theme of the post was,
Yeah.
we're firing kids off into this. They're 18 years old. And one of the things people remember about college, myself included, was it was the first time you lived away, had freedom, could drink, could party, could control your life. And so you're almost paying like this $150,000 stipend just to have a life. But if you went, and you could do that anywhere, you could do it as a job, you could do it as an apprentice. So what was the best part of your college degree? Like in terms of the things that you think about and learn, or the way you learned about reading? I mean, those are some pretty heavy topics.
Well, so for me, like, honestly, like, it's the process of how to study something that I learned a lot with. And I really learned it more in grad school than I did in undergrad. Undergrad's kind of like, I don't know, I find undergrad just be a waste of time. Like, did I really need to take psychology? Did I really need to take like different sciences? Like, I have nothing to do with those things. Like, I learned a lot about studying different subjects and learning about them in graduate school. Like, how do you research a subject, which is something I still use today when I'm preparing for podcast interviews. So like the ability and how I research is the biggest skill I learned. Now, did I need to pay $100 and something thousand to do that? I don't know, because I'm a very self-driven learner. So like, I think there was one graduate professor I paid attention to because he was extremely interesting and ended up being my thesis advisor when I ended up to put it together. But a lot of those classes, I didn't pay attention because I did all my reading outside of class, and I learned more than, a lot of the students in my class because I was self-driven on that. So I think at the same time, like, we have different learning modalities as well. And the way most college classes are done are, they put up the notes on the board, they put up the PowerPoint, they talk to you for 2 hours because these college classes are long. And I don't find that to be useful, right? I just don't find it to be useful. I'm very driven by reading a book, learning from that book, seeing what I can do to synthesize that. So for me, that's a big deal. And I've learned a lot about that. But I'll be honest with you, man, I learned the most the year after I couldn't get a job getting out of college, getting out of grad school. I worked at night managing a gym. I'd work from like 6 o'clock until 11 every night. And then during the day, I work for a super old school house painter, and we work from 6 a.m. until about 4:30 every day. And I learned, number one, the value in hard work. Like, it was manual labor. Like, we didn't use sprayers. We scraped everything by hand. We were on 40-foot wooden ladders that you had to carry over your head to get it over the building. So like, I learned a lot about that, but also at the same time, he'd bring me when he did proposals for guys. So we'd walk around and be like, okay, so that's going to take like 4 gallons of paint there. And I would always be impressed how he could do that and just look at that and understand that. So I've learned a lot about like, well, how much should something cost? Like, a business owner at least needs to make 2 times on what it's costing them. They're not going to make any money. So like, I've learned a lot about that in the 1 year I worked for a painter, which was incredible in between, like actually finding a job and getting out of grad school.
It's funny because I read that in your bio, and I wrote in my book, What the F is Wrong with Everybody Else, What They Didn't Teach You in Business School. One of the best lessons I had was between I think it was my second and my third year. I went for 6 years. So it was between second and third, or third and fourth. It's all very hazy.
Yeah.
And I was the manager of a student painting franchise, having never painted before. And then what was worse was I was really good at sales.
Yeah.
And it didn't dawn on me that my skill as a salesman was strongly correlated with how much I was underpricing all of the jobs that I offered.
Yep.
And so I mean, that summer I got crushed financially. I started the summer with 16 employees, having never managed anyone before, and I didn't want to fire anyone. 13 quit. My sister did not quit. And one guy that I had to fire. The story about that's in the book. But I agree, those jobs, they teach you a lot about interpersonal and manual labor and follow-up and sales, which comes to the overarching theme of education is the education system really preparing our kids for what they are truly doing, or are we just punching tickets? And like you said, you couldn't get a loan to start a painting franchise, but you could get a $150,000 loan to go to college.
Well, and you look at it like there's so many people that I know that came out with like theoretical degrees. You know what I mean? Like, like blah, blah, blah studies or something like that. It's like, what are you ever going to do with that? Like, what are you going to produce with that? And it's, as I said, I was a history major. So it's like, I had to figure out what to do with that. Like, I think that a lot of these majors, they sound nice, they sound cool, they sound interesting, but you have to think about like, what are my job prospects when I'm done with this? And I feel like that's one of the really big problems where even your advisors in school are going wrong. Like, they're not thinking with, how are you going to get a career after this? They're thinking with, what's the next course I can get you into, or what does the next major look like, or how are we going to get into grad school, or how are we going to get you into a PhD program? That's all they're thinking with. They're not thinking with, what career are you going to go into? What is your, prospects for making money when you're done with this?
I totally agree. But you did come out of there with an interesting master's in Roman propaganda, right?
Yeah.
So if you were to compare and contrast, because people talk about the fall of the Roman Empire, just for fun, I watched Gladiator again this weekend, which is a glorious movie. Russell Crowe in his thin time. But when you think about the Roman Empire and where they were at, and then you think about American civilization and where we're at and what we're seeing and the expansion of social media, and how do you draw compare and contrast to the Roman Empire?
I think it contrasts more than anything. And the reason being is because, as the Roman Empire was falling, or as not really the Roman Republic into the Roman Empire is really what I focused on. So it's when the Republic ended, when the empire began. Yeah. The big difference there is, in that point in time, like, the leaders had the control of the media and all this different stuff. And we don't actually have that, right? Like, that's the interesting thing about America. You have right now one political party is in power. The other one controls everything else. So it's not quite the same. But I think at the same time, it's weird with social media, man, because it's like, this is true, this isn't true, that's true. But they become like the arbiters of truth. And it's become very, very odd. So I don't think it compares with how the Roman Republic fell, because that really was driven by the politicians that were in power. I think right now you have this really weird dichotomy between one party that's still in power, for a little bit longer, and you have another one that kind of controls everything else. And it's weird. Like, there's two realities.
I agree. And so this is one of the things that I found, like, how there's unintended consequences. Yeah. And it could be, it could be taking a college degree that, you find out you can't get a job in history. One of our previous guests, Harris Kupperman, who I had on 2 weeks ago, he's a history major who became a hedge fund manager. Yeah. And because, again, you research and you look at history and you look at parallels and off you go. But I found that Twitter adding the false flag, was actually worse. Because up until that point, you had to read something, and then you'd think about it, and then you'd read the article, and then you'd say, is this true? And then you'd go to different sources and to build a narrative. Whereas now, they just say, this is false, which means if it doesn't have that flag, you might be more inclined to believe that it's true. And that, even just that level of such a subtle influencing, where you can flag something and say, and LinkedIn, when I got kicked off, I said there's virtually zero chance of someone under 50 dying of COVID. Everyone knows that as fact, and yet
I survived.
They flagged it as false information.
Yeah.
But then something on the opposite side, you have a very high chance of dying if you're young. Also false, isn't flagged, but people tend to believe it.
Yeah.
Social media really just and then you have
it's really weird too, because I know I kind of agree with where the president's coming from on this, where he's talking about, hey, we need to handle how some of this information is being out there. But the thing he keeps talking about actually isn't a good thing either, because the thing they've been saying is the Communications Decency Act, which regulates a lot
Section
of stuff.
230.
He's like, oh, let's remove Section 230. Now, the problem with that is these social media companies, since they're going to be looked at as publishers, they'll just start deleting everything,
Right.
and I think that's the problem. So it's the thing that's really weird right now is we have this problem. I actually don't know how we solve it, because this is fake news, like little thing they put on it doesn't make sense. But at the same time, if we remove Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, they're not going to publish anything. So it's like, I don't know how we fix that.
Well, it's interesting because the Section 230 thing came up a lot with LinkedIn. And my take on it, for what it is worth, is that Section 230 should allow social media companies to not be doing what they're doing, which is they shouldn't be deplatforming people. They shouldn't be using algorithms to amplify some voices and not other voices. They just let it exist. And that's the role it plays. The interesting thing is they don't want to play that role. They want to play the role of arbiter, because at the end of the day, their business model is solely based on the ability to command eyeballs and generate revenue. And so it's
almost like
interesting.
It's almost like they're daring. They're kind of daring him to do it. Like you won't hit the button type of thing. You know what I mean?
Oh, it's going to be interesting. And then in the whole world of social media, where Twitter has 280 characters, very short attention spans, arguments, people love it. It's like this adrenaline rush once a day. Yeah. But then there's podcasts. And you obviously have been in the podcast game for a very long time. How has it evolved in your view? And how do you see people using it both to build their own brand? Who's doing it well? Who's not doing it well? And what role does podcasting play in the future of media versus social media?
It's interesting, because I feel like the thing that you mentioned there, like 280 characters. Where I remember back in the days it was 140, man, because people would do it from text messages to Twitter. Like, wow, that was crazy.
Right.
Well, the thing we're dealing with here is we can actually have long form conversations, right? And you can kind of talk out a lot of things. And I think that's the interesting thing, because you can't do that in a radio show. They're pretty short when you have a guest on. TV is the same thing, if you can even get on TV anymore. So I think the thing that's interesting about podcasting is it's kind of made this space where people can have long form conversations. And I think, honestly, those are the people that are doing it right. And I'll just add to this. I'm going to be honest with you. This is the most fun I've had on a podcast in a while. So you're doing an awesome job here.
I really appreciate that.
Because it's not the same exact interview that I always do. And I think those are the people that aren't doing it right? They get on there and they have 10 questions ready to go. They're the same 10 questions that everybody else has ready to go. It's the people that are having long form conversations that enlighten, teach, and kind of really do make an impact that are doing it right. So why do people like Joe Rogan? Not everybody can listen to his 3 to 5 hours, but it's a long form conversation that isn't really planned out. And that's what people like, right? My dad started watching a show on Netflix yesterday. And
which one?
I can't remember what it was called, but it was like this girl gets like picked up in like the woods or something like that, and whatever. And in the first 5 minutes, I had told him what the plot was going to be just by like looking at it. And the next day we went golfing, and he's like, "Oh, so you were 100% right about the plot of that movie yesterday." But so like that's how people feel about a lot of these podcasts, right? They're exactly the same. It's the ones that are doing the differentiation, having really impactful conversations that are long form, that are doing it right.
So talk about your podcast, because before you started the media company Command Your Brand, you had one that was sort of I would take it as a reflection of how you had got to that point in your life and what you did to take control. Sure. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, and I would say it's evolved a lot. Like in the beginning, I did a lot of those things I just criticized, because you don't really know, right? You're trying to find your sea legs in some way. You're trying to find out like what works for you. and you kind of use those things because you're not comfortable in the beginning. So that's kind of where it started. And it started with like, hey, just trying to figure out how do I do this thing called life in the way that I want to do it, because this is what I was told, and it's obviously not true. Like, you don't just get an education, they give you a job and it's wonderful and you're there for 40 years. So I was
that
trying
would
to
be
figure out,
nice though, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
That would be very 1984, but it would
it'd
be
be like,
great.
it'd be like, what's the point at that point? I mean, there's
Yeah.
no creativity in that. So like, that's kind of what I was trying to figure out. And that's where it started. But as like, I guess as I've grown, the show's grown and changed as well. And, now we're talking to a lot of people that are world-class and like extraordinary humans. So I'm talking to, some incredible athletes, some incredible artists, some, incredible business people. And that's kind of where it's gone and evolved. And, I prepare with maybe 3 to 5 things I want to talk about in that conversation, and then it goes where it goes. I used to prepare with, 30 questions and, a rapid fire round like everybody does. It's just kind of, as the show evolves and you evolve and your skill set evolves, that's kind of where it went.
So I know that every episode is like a baby. That's how I feel. So I hate when people say, "What's your favorite episode?"
It's hard.
But it is really hard, right? But are there some conversations that, and it doesn't matter, just some conversations that really strike you as someone who maybe surprised you? Because I think that's the point on Joe Rogan. Sometimes I'll scan his list because he puts out so much content, and I'll be like, "Oh, I recognize that person. I recognize that person." But some of the best ones I listen to, or some of the best shows that I have, are people I don't know what to expect, and I truly learn from them. So curious if you've had some of those on your show.
I feel like the hard part on this though is it's always the most recent one. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like that's always the viewpoint on it because it's freshest in your mind.
Right.
Like I just interviewed a guy last week, and we ended up putting it out today because I was so excited about it. Dr. Mark Gordon, and he was saying that 80 to 90%, and this is from his experience as a doctor, of 80 to 90% of what people call mental illness is actually just traumatic brain injury, because he's actually researched he's working with a lot of former military, a lot of people that have kind of been athletes and stuff like that. Like, the NFL, you have guys killing themselves after their career. And he's found out that it's actually like a lot of chronic inflammation in their head from all these head injuries that, can actually be like gotten rid of by a very natural protocol of like getting rid of inflammation. So it like kind of blew my mind because that wasn't where I was expecting it to go. So like we get in the end and we're talking about the Aaron Hernandez story about how he played, with the Patriots.
Right.
And he starts telling, and I said, are you familiar with the story? He goes, yeah, I worked with the NFL for a little bit, and they weren't really as interested in my program as the military was. But now, since we're having success with the military, the NFL is calling again. And he said, looking at it, like, he has every symptom of somebody with a traumatic brain injury. He's like, we could have, helped that guy had we known beforehand a lot of these things he was suffering with. So I think it's just really interesting in that viewpoint to realize, because, they put a lot of these military guys on drugs and they're still killing themselves. So obviously it's not working. So he's finding like we're actually fixing people by getting rid of this chronic inflammation. So it kind of blew my mind.
So it's interesting not to rehash that conversation because we'll have one of our own. But no, I was in Arizona over the weekend with some friends of mine, and who, if they're listening, I apologize. I'm not going to tell any of the other good stories. But I mean, in a way, I called it the 4D trip. Because one of the guys, his wife was diagnosed. I mean, young guy. He just turned 50. His wife was diagnosed with brain cancer 11 months ago. She passed away 6 weeks ago. So he covered off the death in the group. We have another friend who's just getting divorced. We had another friend who, because of the COVID pandemic, got demoted, and then we had me, who I think is fair to say has been depressed. And I go back and forth on depression, but the reason I raise it is in the context of what you said. When you lose something, whether it's a wife, whether it's a job, whether it's a way of life, which professional sports
that's a loss. Yeah,
it's a loss. And so these professional athletes go from being loved, having all this money, having all this attention, and regardless of the brain injury aspect, the other element is they've lost their life. And so many divorces happen in professional sports.
Athletes die twice, man. They die when their career's over, and then when they actually do.
And so it's just interesting in the context of depression, because then you add a proclivity to it because of this, but we never look at the causality. Causality isn't necessarily correlation. And I think about these high profile, really wealthy people who have this incredible life, and then all of a sudden it's just kind of taken from them. And it's interesting as you try and find the pivot. And you found the pivot when you finished the career in painting and moved to podcasting
Yeah.
and then have been able to grow the show.
Hmm.
What's next, do you think, for you in the show? And what are you trying to accomplish with the brand?
Well, so the PR agency has been growing really, really fast. That's kind of, where we've had our focus probably the last over 4 years. And, now I've been working on a book right now called Extraordinary, which is coming out in the spring. And it's based on, the 6 principles I've learned from all the extraordinary individuals on the show. So that's kind of the direction things are going, as I'm really trying to figure out how I can distill down all these things I've learned and teach people from those. Because it's like, the crazy thing about it is you keep hearing it again and again and again and again, and you're like, wow, there's something here.
Mm-hmm.
So for me and where I'm going, that's really the biggest focus right now, is distilling down the principles and teaching people from those, because they're quite consistent across the board.
Are there any of them that you can talk about pre the book that really surprised you? Because, and again, this is the GPA concept, and it's all tied up. And in the long form communication, you can have nuance.
Yeah.
But it's like hard work. Everyone knows that.
Yeah.
Luck.
Obviously.
Everyone knows that. But how have you seen different factors that surprised you?
So I don't know if it's really surprising, but it's something that I think a lot of people shy away from, and that's the idea of adversity. Like adversity for people that can use it as a tool or use it as an ability to grow. Like, people that have been through crazy adversity, like they've been through some stuff, man. So they're willing to do a lot more and take a lot more than a lot of other people. Like, maybe they've had a death in the family, or maybe they've been homeless, or maybe, they've had their whole business crumble. People like that can come through that and come out the other side. They'll do more than you can. They'll work harder than you can, because they've had the bottom of the barrel, man. So like anything up from there is kind of gravy. So I think like that idea of adversity is pretty incredible. The other thing that kind of fits in with what we're talking about here, and it's based on a book I read by Cal Newport, and then I had Cal on the show after that. It's called So Good They Can't Ignore You. He talks about this idea of finding something you're good at and continuing to refine that and get better and better and better at that. And then when it becomes effortless, like we were talking about with Patrick Mahomes, like that's kind of where the passion for what you do comes in. But I find too many times people want to start with the passion. They're like, and especially in my generation, I'm in my mid-30s. I feel like a lot of people are like, oh, I don't know if I'm passionate. I have to find my passion, or I'm not going to do anything. And it's like, you're kidding me, man. Like, go out and get a job, do something. But I feel like people want to find the passion before they really want to work at something. And that's the biggest thing I learned from Cal.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Like people who are 35 and are still trying to discover themselves, which comes back, I think, to the education system.
Correct.
And a lot of the things
broken.
that we're talking about with, it's systemic racism, it's classism, it's this, it's that. Well, no, we've designed a school where we use the GPA, and when we don't message to kids, if you have a 2.3 and you're getting D's in math, you're not going to be good at math. You got to find something you're going to be good at. And if we spend the first 12 years of a kid's life helping them find what they're good at, passion comes from being good at something. Like if you had told me when I was 9 that I was going to be passionate about squash, no, of course I wasn't going to be passionate about squash. I wasn't good at squash. But then you grow and you get better, and then you travel and then you get better, and then you become like passionate about it. So it's one leads the other, and I don't think that we think about that as a society as much.
It's interesting because it's as we said, like you have to kind of work at something to even know what you like, right? It's like somebody that wants to keep playing a video game on easy mode all the time, and then it kind of gets boring after a while. Like, you know what I mean? It's just you got to continue to work at something and work at something and work at something.
Well, what would be your adversity? I mean, I know. So one of the things you talked about was sort of your early near-death experience, and I think it was like a elective surgery or something. And so talk about that.
I was playing football, and I was playing corner. I'm in my 5-yard back pedal. I turned to run with the receiver, and I stepped in a drain, and I tore 3 major ligaments in my knee. Surgery was pretty easy, but the anesthesia didn't go well, and they basically almost killed me. And my right lung overexpanded, my left lung collapsed, and I spent 3 days with low blood oxygen levels. I'm trying to get them up, and I actually got lacerates and everything like that. But that didn't really change my life, man. Like it didn't really do anything for me. Like when I got done with that, I kind of just went back to what I was doing. I was 19 years old. When I was 24, I had been teaching high school for about 2 years at that point. When I was 24, I almost lost my mom to a stroke. and she's still has no language skills really to this day. She's lost control of the right side of her body, and like that was really, 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 really hard because it kind of rocked my whole world, because it's
Yeah.
like, my family is very close and very tight, and that kind of made me realize, like, this thing called life could end. You know what I mean? I feel like when I was 19, it's kind of like, you're 19, whatever. So,
Do you think that the 19-year-old experience came with you so that the heaviness of what happened to your mom
yeah,
was more intensely felt?
I would agree with that. It kind of hit me on a delayed reaction. It took 5 years to hit me. So I think at that point in time, like, had I had one of those things or the other, it may not have went the way it did. But because I had both things, it did.
So how do you approach your life differently now? And I'll put it in the context of a slightly controversial topic, but again, it's long form communication. But
Yeah.
like when you hear COVID and then you've
Mm-hmm.
had, you could have died because you twisted your knee in a drain, and
Yeah.
your mom had a stroke that's left her not the way she was. And
Yeah.
then we have this COVID thing.
Yeah.
Do you think that you approach it differently because of those experiences, or how do you think about life differently today than you might have before?
Well, first of all, I had COVID for like 3 days, and it was kind of like a low grade cold, and then I got over it. But I
You,
guess in
you mean
terms,
so Chris Christie survived the most lethal thing in the world that you have to be tested to know you have it?
For people that do have like comorbidities and stuff, it's like not a good deal. But for most people, it's just not a big deal. For me, it wasn't. So we did pretty okay with it. But I guess in terms of how I approach life, like, you kind of look at like the impact of what you're doing, right? Like, you look at, like, I think so many times we do things just because we do them. You know what I mean? Like, oh, this is the next step. I guess this is where you go after here. Or, like, is this what retirement looks like? I think that's how people kind of just approach life. Like, now you approach, okay, what's the bigger plan? What am I doing with this? And I think you start to look at, okay, what I'm doing now, does this align with where I want to be? Does this align with, what I want to be doing or the impact I want to make? So you kind of have a viewpoint shift, where most people are on autopilot through life, man. They're just kind of like, all right, next step. Okay, next step. Is somebody going to give me a job now? Like, I think that's how most people view things. But when you've had something like that happen, you look at, why am I doing this? And does this align with the impact that I want to make?
Now, how when you think about podcasting, I know
Yeah.
in the oil and gas industry, there's been a proliferation of podcasts of late, and in part because people have been trying to pivot. And I think that in our industry historically, you were sort of paid to not say anything and not be controversial, and it was a bit stodgy. So no one wanted to build a brand. So when I
Right.
started typing on LinkedIn 2 years ago, and there was others, Colin McClellan comes to mind, but they were putting themselves out there, saying things and building a brand. And then now we've had a whole bunch of people come in. But how do you differentiate free content versus planned content versus monetized content? And how do you put it all together for both the clients you're working with and as you think about your own podcast?
Well, that I guess is the $1 million question. You know what I mean? Because if you can kind of make all three of those things work, you'd be legendary. Because I think for all of us, we're just trying to find out where it works. Like, for me, I look at the podcast as more of like a PR vehicle. You know what I mean? Like, it's something that lets you connect with the right people. Like, if we didn't have, if you and I didn't have podcasts, like, people really wouldn't hang out with us for some amount of time to, like, on the level they do. You know what I mean? Like, you
For
wouldn't
sure.
really have that.
For
So
sure.
that's kind of one part of it, is the connection and the networking. But also at the same time, like, it allows me to get a lot of media coverage. It allows me to be in Forbes and Inc. and a lot of these things. Like, otherwise I wouldn't have a reason to. So I look at it really as, I guess, kind of your overall PR vehicle for what you're doing. Now we do have like some affiliate offers and stuff like that. Like, my favorite is Audible. I usually tell people like what book I'm reading, and then they'll go grab their free Audible membership to read that book. So that's the way I look at it. And the way that I look at it in terms of your business is, I think of it more like the front end. Like, people see that, they understand you, they trust you, so they want to know more about what you're doing. So everything else you're doing is more credible, if that makes it makes sense.
And so how much do you think of, like, let's use Joe Rogan as an example,
Yeah.
because he grew, he had a thing that was getting him access, but then he
Yeah.
became the thing.
Yeah.
So how do you think he does what he's doing, and how does he regrow and keep fresh? And like, he's kind of the, I mean, he is what podcasting is right now, and
Yeah.
everyone wants to be him. And it's just been interesting to watch. Certainly, you've been in
Yeah.
the podcast game for a long time. I know he's been in since 2009. It's interesting to watch how you go from just this random thing you do with friends to this, well, now I have access to these people, to now everyone is listening to me, and they're less interested in the guests almost.
That's really interesting. because I feel like most people are never going to be him. You know what I mean? Like and that's the weird part about it, but they think they are. Because he also had a following before he started this thing. Like he was on Fear Factor. He was announcing for UFC. He was a comedian. So it's like he also kind of had a lot of that going for him, when he got into here. So it was easier to build an audience around it. And that's not to say he doesn't do an awesome job. Like he does a really good job around the show. But I think most people don't have those things going for them. So it's going to be a little bit harder. You know what I mean? So you were going to say something.
No, I was going to say, because it makes me like Joe Rogan again. He's sort of like all over the place. And then you and I, we started with sports, which again is interesting because sports are so accessible, and in a way they're mindless. So every podcast, you can have 1 million listeners or whatever if you're just talking about the NFL football, but in a way we're not really talking about the real problems. And this is not to take anything away from sports, but I think sports is an outlet for people who are wanting a break from life. And I think that's what we saw with the NBA and their stance on social justice. Was it turns out that the average 50-year-old who's coming home from work wanting to just sit on the couch and watch a beer or go to Buffalo Wild Wings with his buddies is not really interested in the whole social justice thing. But I'm interested to, will podcasting start tackling some of these major issues like we've seen in politics in this last year, where education is a problem, taxes is a problem, entitlements is a problem, race is, like, all these things are being talked about, but not in long form. Mm-hmm. What do you think about that?
I think it's definitely going to help the conversation if it goes in that direction, because a lot of the way that we've tried to solve this stuff is through like snippets on social media, and nothing is solved with a snippet. You know what I mean? Because a snippet is easy to stand behind and it's easy to promote and put on BuzzFeed or whatever. But the way this thing is solved is by conversations. So I do think that's where podcasting sits. And I think if you look at people like Joe Rogan, like having some of the conversations and stuff they're having with people, I think that is the way that we kind of make changes, by actually having real conversations, not by, you know what I mean? Because you look at people arguing on social media, like about any of the subjects you just talked about. One side says you're stupid and the other side says you're dumber. You know what I mean? Like, how is that solving anything? And I think that's the problem we run into. And it's like, I can comment positively on somebody's feed or negatively on somebody's feed, and the number of crazy things I get that have to do with me personally and nothing on the subject, it's like, that's not solving anything. Yeah. And I think the difference is a lot of this is driven by real conversations without people jumping in there and telling you you're stupid.
So it's kind of funny on the negative. How do you stay above being trolled? Because clearly you would be, everyone who has any public image, whether you're the president or not, you have a 50% of the country loves you and 50% doesn't. And trolling tends to, like, it's almost a hobby at this point. How do you personally stay above the fray and not get into it? And how do you manage it for your mental health?
So it depends, like, because I feel like every situation's different, you know what I mean? But I tend to agree. I don't know if you follow Joel Comm at all. But Joel made a really interesting statement about this. He goes, most trolls, if you engage with them, it's only going to get worse from there. So a lot of times, depending on the severity of it, if it's especially on Twitter, I will block that troll, because you can't win. They won't let you win. Like I said something about masks here in New Jersey. And so somebody does a close-up of my screenshot and starts talking about how bad my teeth are. I'm like, you're kidding me, right? That has nothing to do with what I just said. Right. So I think you have to look at each situation individually and say, okay, can I have a conversation with this person? So usually check out what they're doing, check out the other things they say. If they will, I'll engage. Or if you look at it and all they do is troll people, it's like, well, I'm just going to block that person. And how you can tell a lot of times is they have 0 followers and they're following 110 people or 100 people. That's the person you block, because literally all they do is sit on there all day and just say negative things to people. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's interesting again, and I think COVID was expanded. Like the crisis has been expanded to a mental health issue, but also because we live in this virtual world where we're friends with people we've never met because we engage on social media. So when they took away us leaving the house to go socialize with friends and have long form conversations at dinner tables, we all sort of came back reclusive to this little device in our hand. And I'm guilty of it as much as anybody. Losing LinkedIn has made me really recalibrate my thinking about social media and the role in social media, and whether, like, snippets that can be taken out of context versus long form communication is a much better path. But it's hard not to be in an echo chamber. So you're very well read. You're obviously like you're building a brand. How do you make sure you're hearing voices on both sides and not just getting frustrated and yelling at the TV when you hear someone who's opposite to you?
Well, I think it's also the way that you look at information, right? You look at something, you say, is that useful to me or is it not useful to me? Do you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of really bad information out there. So like that goes back to my ability to study and research things. If I can independently take a look at something and say, oh, that makes sense, or that seems like it works, that's the information I'll look at. I had a conversation with on my podcast with Dave Rubin from the Rubin Report.
Yeah.
And he wrote a book called "Don't Burn This Book." And he said one of the important things that he does is he tries to talk to people that have differing opinions, because then if you can talk it out and kind of see where this person's coming from, you can kind of see what works for you and what doesn't. And I think that's one of the things that we have to get really, really good at, is taking a look at what makes sense to us, because a lot of times you can look at an argument and you can see the dislogic in it. You know what I mean? And I think that's one of the important things to take a look at.
Well, and it comes again back to education, because I think that we're cramming kids with a narrative, whether it's on climate change or whatever, but they're not being taught to think. And I don't know your opinion on this, but the whole
that's a really, really great point. One of the best classes I ever took in college was logic, and you're taught like how to think, not what to think. You can look at it and you can say, if this is true, then that must be true, or that must not be true. People don't learn that stuff. They're just kind of like, think this, think this, think this. You have to learn how to think, man.
Yeah, or you get, especially on the political side or the mass side, you get boiled into this debate of masks versus not, abortion versus not, whatever, and it always defaults to the political lines. But I find if you actually have a conversation with people, the thing that's actually really getting them is not remotely the issue, and I'm sure masks is the one. Now, as I don't know your view on it, are you pro-mask or are you anti-mask?
It depends on the situation. I don't think they help a lot just because of the size of the molecules and stuff like that. But I tend to not wear one when I can get away with it. But you know what I mean? I'm just kind of ready to go back to normal life. But I think the issue that we kind of have here, and it's actually a very, very old PR technique, actually. It's called the Overton Window.
Okay.
And the idea of an Overton Window is if you show two extremes and you pick something in the middle, it's still pretty extreme, but because you're telling two sides, it's easier. And that's why, like, even, a Republican Democrat dichotomy is dangerous, right? Because people can only pick one of two things.
Right.
So I think that's the thing you said, masks or no masks, or there's gray areas in everything, but we've been taught to believe there isn't. It's either one way or the other, and that's just not true.
So speaking of balance, one of the things you talked about in the bio, you balance fitness with being a father. Yes? How old are your kids?
My daughter is 2. We have another one on the way.
Wow. Okay. And so how have you my wife and I always called those the dark ages, like until the kids are like 3 and 5, they get to the enlightenment. But like, how have you been able to manage and manage building a brand and building a career and having a partner and having kids and taking time for yourself? What's your strategy on that?
Well, so first of all, I work out early. I work out at 6:30, 7 o'clock in the morning. My daughter sleeps till 8:30. So that's been just strategically, that makes sense. You kind of get done a lot of that stuff right away. At the same time, my wife and I work together, so we also kind of share schedules with each other so that we know, like, okay, you have something going on at this time, or I have something going on this time. And that's been a big deal as well. As I mentioned earlier, my mom's disabled, but she's helpful enough that we have her at the house a couple days a week, and she's been able to help us with some stuff. So you kind of make it all work, man, and you kind of just make sure you're communicating. And I find that, I'm in my mid-30s, so I don't have some of the life experience other people have, but I find that, at least in my marriage and everything else, as long as we communicate and let the other person know what's going on, it's a lot easier to solve a situation. I find that whether it's in marriages or friendships or whatever, when people don't communicate and make the other person wrong, that's when you don't solve anything. So I found that that's how we've kind of been able to make a lot of stuff work.
So what advice would you have to people who are working from home now in the same location as their spouse? Because in a way, you are working together. You might not be working on the same projects, but like a lot of people, and now their kids, everyone is at home all day long doing video calls and conference calls. What advice have you had with working with your wife and then having like separation of boundaries, and do you have rules in place for that, or what are you doing to make that a success?
So I think it kind of really just goes back to what we just talked about, because like, and I think we kind of had a leg up on everybody because everybody got forced home this year, but we've been doing this since 2015. So we've kind of learned like what worked in that way. And one of the biggest things is we have a shared Google Calendar, and we know who's got calls at what time so we can make it work. I find a lot of times people don't tell their spouse or their kids or something. They're just like, I'm going to call, shut up. You know what I mean? So it's like, there's not that, nobody knows. Like we have for the one room we use for recordings where I am now, there's an on the air sign that goes in the door that's lit up. So like you kind of make a lot of stuff work and make sure you're communicating and let people know like, okay, I have calls at this time, that time, and that time today. What do you have going on? You kind of just plan ahead of time and take a little time to pregame, man. But a lot of times what happens is people make other people wrong for what they don't even know. You know what I mean? You know what I mean?
I had not thought of the on-air sign, but
dude, it's good. It's magical.
That is a really good idea. I bet, like, because everyone has their little spaces in the house, right? And then you come up and you're totally focused on you, and you want a coffee or you want to make a bagel, and someone loves the kitchen, and they might be on a phone call, and then you get in trouble for not knowing that they're doing something. The on-air sign, that's perfect. How did you guys come up with that?
Somebody gave it to me. I was like, oh, on the air. That's great. So like we have it's got like a clicker that's inside the room. You click it for on the air, and people on the outside know. So it's just like you find things to communicate and let the other person know. But like, and I just think anytime in life, we always make other people wrong for what they don't know. You know what I mean? Like, oh, I'm in a hurry. Okay, well, they didn't know that. They're just trying to talk to you. And I think we have to take a little bit more responsibility for a lot of that stuff.
So you're in New Jersey.
Yeah.
How is the vibe comparing to March and April with the lockdowns? And because there's the East, I think about the East Coast as being very different than the West Coast. Obviously we see it politically, and then the Midwest and Colorado and Arizona. Like I was just in Arizona, every bar absolutely packed. Like the second you got in, no one really cared about masks. I mean, it honestly, it felt like February in Arizona, which was amazing. In Colorado, it's like ghost town because everything's closed again. And I hear stories coming out of the Northeast of mass exoduses and stuff. So give us the lowdown on what's going on in New Jersey and what's changed and what you think is coming and what the mood is.
Well, I'll tell you what, like New York City is our metro area. And like, I did an episode with James Altucher about an article he wrote called New York City is dead and this is dead forever and this is why.
Is he the one with the crazy hair?
Oh, he's got the crazy hair.
It's great hair.
Yeah, and like New York City right now, like I went in to do a photo shoot the other day with my photographer. Like you drive in through the Holland Tunnel and boarded up. Like there's like nothing really happening. So I think the problem, and this is the thing that Donald Trump has said about this whole thing, is the cure should not be worse than the disease. And I think what we're doing right now is we're killing ourselves economically. We've got to be a little bit more intelligent with this stuff. Like I interviewed Ian Smith, who's the co-owner of Attila's Gym here in New Jersey, that's had a back and forth fight with our governor. And
right, they opened it, and then the police came, and like this guy, okay.
They have a 15-point safety plan around it. They have these special filters. They have all this stuff going. They had 0 cases in their business. So I think if we approach this stuff a little bit more intelligently than just blindly closing a lot of stuff, like if we were a little bit safer with it, like there's no reason businesses should have to go under. And I think that's what we're kind of dealing with, is just this. And I think the problem is too, whether it's Republican or Democrat, like a lot of these guys haven't ever owned a business. They've went right from law school, like Chuck Schumer in New York, right from law school to government. Like you don't have any life experience then. And I think that's part of the problem. Or even like our governor here in New Jersey, Phil Murphy, he made $60 million in an IPO from Goldman Sachs. He's never produced anything. And I think that's one of the problems we're seeing, is people are just thinking with safety, which is important. You want to think with safety, but also at the same time, like if business doesn't survive, what does it matter if we're safe? You know what I mean?
Isn't it interesting? Like, and I always talk about this, the dichotomy of the fact that businesses are truly closing, and that I saw something on Twitter, and again, it didn't have the false flag, so I'm probably relying on it more than I should. But it said something like 35% of the M1 money that's ever been printed in the United States has been printed since April, So we're on this massive inflationary binge. All assets are worth more. All commodities are worth more. All stock markets are worth more. And yet the people running the businesses, like who earn their living with restaurants and hospitality and schools and in government, as you said, they haven't been furloughed yet.
Yeah.
But like the tax year is about to end and there isn't going to be revenue to pay them.
Yeah.
So then what happens? And I don't know how to...
And part of the problem to that too is people keep saying, oh, cost of everything goes up, cost of living goes up. What actually doesn't. Your dollar's just worth less year after year after year after year after year. So it has less buying power. And that's one of the things we're actually dealing with as well is, you know, like, yeah, the stock market's high, but the money isn't worth as much. You know what I mean? So it's like if you looked at the stock market now versus the stock market 100 years ago, you know what I mean? It's right. The money just isn't worth as much.
It's definitely inflation.
It's inflation, yeah.
So last two questions for you. The first one is, where do you see your podcast and your brand in 5 years? Like, are you just kind of rolling with it, or are you very active and intentional about the plan? And how do you figure out which one's doing better and where to put your time and effort?
Well, the time and effort always goes to the company first, because the company, we're helping people to make an impact, and we work with a lot of people that we call world changers. In terms of like where the podcast is going, you know, I'm always trying to talk to, you know, bigger and better people. Like we had former CIA director on, David Petraeus, which is a really, really interesting interview. You know, but in terms of like where we're going, you know, I feel like the more people I help, the bigger impact we can make. So we just want to kind of, you know, make a bigger impact to become the go-to in our space. That's really where the goal is. I don't think it's a particular, like, you know, when I reach blah, I'll know it. It's more of, we're just trying to make a bigger and bigger impact every day.
Do you think that you'll see mergers and consolidation in the podcast space? Like, do people sort of start one, go for a year, have some success, or don't, and then start merging mail lists and like, do we see bigger content but less hosts, or does it proliferate into like the super niche market of all time in your opinion?
So I think we're kind of in an area where that right now, where we're going to start deciding what that looks like, because I think you're starting to see, you're seeing a lot of people start podcasts but not finish them. You're seeing a lot of consolidation with things like, you know, I think it was Wondery that just brought in Lewis Howes' School of Greatness and stuff. So you're seeing some consolidation right now. So I think the next 1 to 2 years is very, very pivotal to kind of tell us what that's going to look like. But I do think, in all honesty, we're going to see more consolidation.
And do you think that those will also, you'll bring podcasts in under your umbrella of the brand to help build that? Or are you focused on building individuals' brands alone? Because again, I think for those who don't think about their social media brand, I always say that don't use LinkedIn to grow your company. I mean, grow the thing you're doing for your company, but you're trying to make people aware of you as a thought leader in a space so that people will come and talk to you, which is very different than, you know, if you're one of 11 podcasts in the Spotify network. It's a very different thing. So I'm curious which you think is the most effective.
Well, so it just depends where you can get in front of the most people. But I think the thing that's really important here, and this is where a lot of people are like, oh, I just want to get on the radio, or I just want to get on this TV station, whatever it is. You don't own a lot of the content. And I still think that's very, very important. And if you do that right, you can be smaller and still compete bigger, because you still own a lot of the content. Whereas, you know, even a lot of your like media personalities that get out there, like a lot of times they're just reading off a script, man. Like, you know, they work for CNN, or they work for Fox, or they work for one of these agencies, but like a lot of times, like, they're told what to say. They're reading off a teleprompter. And that's why I think the thing that gives you a lot of power right now is you have the ability to have your own unique ideas and viewpoints, which you can lose when you go in with a bigger brand, but you also own a lot of the identities, like your mailing list and stuff like that. So you can make a big impact.
So if you could give yourself some advice that was maybe not the adversity one, because adversity is something that happens to you and then you change and you respond to it.
Sure.
But if you could give yourself some advice going back to yourself as a 19-year-old when you blew your knee, or 24-year-old or coming out of college, what do you think would be the most impactful that would change it would accelerate your path to where you are today, or to where you want to be?
I would just say don't resist it. You know what I mean? Because I think so many times, like, I was like, oh, I can't do this now, or I can't do that now. Like, each one of those things I had to learn how to do. So I would say don't resist the process, you know, kind of just go through the process willingly and see what you can learn from it. Because I learned a lot of stuff, but I could have learned more had I kind of pushed more with it than against the motion. I think a lot of times I did push against the motion rather than with it.
So let the river take you where it's going to go, and do the best you can.
Yes. I would agree.
I love that. I agree with that 100%. Well, Jeremy, it's been a phenomenal conversation. I'm really excited. I'm going to go tune into some of the most recent episodes, and I like your style. I like your charisma. I like the whole thing that you're pulling together, and I'm really excited to watch it grow and have success over the next couple of years.
Absolutely. I really appreciate having me today, man.
Okay, cool. Jeremy, thanks so much. And for all the Hot Take of the Day listeners, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel if that is your source of absorption. You can listen to the media as you're driving to and from work, if that's still a thing for you. Or you can put your earbuds in and pretend like you're working and make your family leave you alone. But until next time, I hope that you be safe, be good, have a great day.